Hello everybody, welcome back to another Learn from the Masters episode. Today we're not going to have a look at one single artist, instead we're going to have a look at 5 different tracks. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the structure of each of them and just see if there are some interesting things in there. Now this stems from my last Learn from the Masters video that I did on Mushroom Song. It was taken offline for a while due to copyright reasons, but it's back up now and I personally think that it's one of my best videos, so check that out for sure. But today we're going to be taking a look at these 5 tracks here. We have 3 fairly progressive tracks, 2 from Astrix and 1 from Ace Ventura and Outsiders. And then we have 2 a little bit more full-on style as well. You can see it in the structure already. This is a little bit denser in the sense of the red being the drop. And the same is true here, shorter breaks, more time to dance, so this is definitely more full-on style. But there's definitely interesting things in all of them. Now before we get into that, we do have to talk about the kind of standard arrangement approach for psytrance. So with an empty MIDI track, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw out sections of 16 bars. We'll make one that is white and then we'll make one that is dark so you can see the difference. I'm just going to duplicate this over. You can already see it, but we'll start at the start. Here you can see this track is really following the 16 bar structure. Looking into this, you can see that our intro is up until here, and this is exactly at the point where there is a change. And this is also the place where a 16 bar end of the segment exists. And what you'll find for the drop, again, very standard, is that your whole drop segments are going to be 16 bars long, and then your fill will be at the end here. Now, unfortunately, due to the previous copyright reasons that I talked about, I'm not going to be playing these tracks. I highly recommend that you look them up for yourself. This first one is Sapana by Astrix, and this is the album version. But we can clearly see from the waveform that everything that I've set up until now is clearly the case. Now, this continues for a while. We have a 2-bar fill as the first fill, and then just a normal 1-bar fill for the second. For the third, we have a half a bar fill. And I think what is going on here is, in terms of the fill lengths, the fills keep on getting shorter and shorter as the track becomes more full of energy, full of elements, stuff like that. Because obviously, throughout all of these drops, the energy is rising. That's kind of the goal of progressive. Slowly taking over the energy and just slowly going up. And then the first interesting thing happens, and that is that we don't have a fill at all for this last segment of the drop here. This is the first drop and this is the last segment of it. You can see we're going into a breakdown marked by the green here. And if we zoom in, you can see that it's red all the way up until the end. Now, this is something that I personally don't really do. I do like to finish all of my sections with a fill, but it's something that through this analysis I've seen quite a bit. So maybe I will start changing that as well. Because I think what can happen is that there's some cool musical ideas in that the bass line really finishes with the musical phrase here. Normally what happens is, say that you have a 2-bar musical phrase, something like this. You can obviously duplicate. I'll draw it out with the MIDI instead, so we can draw something like this, and then again we just change the color so that it indicates, let's say that this is your musical phrase, kind of your musical melody, or maybe you have a vocal line which is 2 bars long. In that case, if we duplicate this over, you can see that exactly at this endpoint it's going to stop. If you were to have a fill here, you would need to have either a fill of 2 bars so that the whole segment kind of fits into that fill, or you're going to have it so that the fill only covers half of the musical phrase. And in that case, that might be quite limiting, because what can happen is that if this musical idea that you're using here, the one that is 2 bars long, is fairly loud, it doesn't leave you a lot of space in the actual fill to do all of your fill stuff. Remember that the goal of a fill is actually to transition from one element to the next, and usually what you want to do is you want to step down a little bit in energy, step down in the elements, so that the new elements can be introduced. But in this case, I think because we're going to a breakdown, you don't really have to do that, because the breakdown elements are just all going to start and coming in like here. So what will happen is all of the elements will rise up until this point, and then you'll have a big impact here, and then it's immediately into the breakdown. Now here's another example of a part where we don't exactly have a fill here at the end, but what is happening here is that we have this build up here, and basically all of the elements continue, including the kick and the bass. The only thing that happens is that the kick and bass is filtered here and a little bit quieter. So that gives you more room for the other elements that help with the build-up, your snare rolls, your rises and all of that good stuff. But it means again that there's no significant change that needs to happen here, so we can just continue the kick and bass up until this point right here. Now, one of the interesting things is that this part here is the first part where we're going off the grid, but it's kind of contained in that if you combine all these 3 elements here, and the drop as well, you will see that you get a 32-bar segment. And the interesting thing is that there's one element that just kind of sits throughout this whole thing. We have it filtering in the intro here, then it comes throughout here, and then it transitions out again here. It's that very glitchy cool sequence that sits in this part of the drop. So this part is completely kind of contained in there, and it's basically serving as one big 32 bar segment. The very first part that doesn't really work with our grid is going to be this part, because it's not 16 bars long. And you can see that even the next segments and all of the segments after that really don't align with the beat anymore, or with these 16 bar segments anymore. Now personally, I think that the musical idea behind these longer segments is really clear, in that you just want to imprint that segment a little bit more. Maybe you have a very cool lead that you want to play to the listener for a little bit longer than just your standard 16 bars, then you can go for something like this, which is 24 bars. So basically what we're doing is we're using a normal 16 bar segment, and then we're plugging in another 8 bar segments after that, and then we're just kind of offsetting the whole rest of the track. You can see that this is still 16 bars long. If I move this right here, we can verify that. But now it's offset with kind of your standard arrangement approach. Now the same is going to be true for this segment right here. If you place this here, you can see that, oh no, wait. And this is where it really started to change for me. As you can see, this isn't your standard kind of length. You would either expect this to stop here, or if you want it to be 24 bars, you would expect it to stop here. But it doesn't do that. It just kind of sits in the middle there. And this is where I started to realize that sometimes the structure needs to bend to the musical idea. What I've always been doing is that I've been placing my musical ideas very structurally in the track, so that we maintain kind of your standard structure or something really, really close to that. But this segment here is 20 bars long, so it completely shifts it in a weird way, in that this isn't even in the middle of this part here. You would need to make 2 divisions of this segment here, 1 and 2 here, to line it up with this part here. Again, I can color this so that you can see it better. Now the strange thing is that this isn't really ever restored. If we look into this part here, we can move this over and we'll see that right here where the build begins, we have another segment. This is another 8 bars, and then we go into our drops, and everything is again 16 bars and 8 bars, and this is together 32 bars. But it's all offset by these 4 extra bars that is stuck on the end of this section right here. Now the final interesting thing about this part here, this kind of slowdown part, is actually the buildup here and the subsequent fill. As you can see, our buildup is 7 bars long, so you would expect another bar for a fill, so that we again align with whatever is happening here. But that's not the case. This is a 2 bar fill. So here again, we're offsetting it so that it fits the musical idea. In this case, the musical idea is that there's this quells thing that slowly comes in at first, and then for the second time around, for the second bar, it plays its normal sequence, and then we go into the drop. For some reason, he decided that it was very important that this element kind of slowly came in first, and then it announced its actual sequence that it was going to play. But he also wanted to have that kind of classical 7 bar buildup, where you have 4 bars for your first speed of the snares or whatever you have. Then you go to 8 notes usually, and that's going to be 2 bars long. And then you have your 16 notes, again doubling the speed, and that's going to go on for 1 final bar until you go usually into your 1 bar fill. Now I'm not going to deep dive into all 5 of these tracks, and I'm not going to deep dive in the rest of this further. There's one more interesting thing, and that is again the lack of a fill here going into the outro. The reason why this works is because there's an element that neatly transitioned over, and we basically maintain the same elements and the main ideas. So there isn't, again, a big change here, and therefore you don't need the fill to make that actual transition. Now, before we move on with the next track, if you're new here and you want to support the channel, make sure that you like the video and that you're subscribed. Also, you can support me financially by checking out my products on Gumroad or checking out my Patreon page. Now let's get back into the video. The next track is going to be Free Your Soul by Ace Ventura and Outsiders. And here again, we can see some very interesting stuff right off the bat. You can see that I have this little extra segment in here. And that's because what I've done is I've basically taken this intro and I've divided it up into multiple sections. When we looked at that Astrix intro, you can see that it's just one section, and this is something that we'll see in his next track as well. He likes to just go into an intro and transition into a track. Usually there aren't any build-ups happening, there isn't a lot of crazy stuff happening here, and it's just rising up until the energy level is alright for the drop, and then we get into the drop. What Ace Ventura and Outsiders are doing here though is that they're building up the energy level over here, and then we take a slight step back. This is still building though. And then right here, we have this big impact, and you can see it in the waveform. It just really slows down, gives you space to anticipate the impact of the actual drop. And then you turn into what is actually the drop here. There's a few rises in this part and a final vocal, but it's not really building up anymore. And what happens basically is that the energy level is taken really, really high in this part here. And then we just kind of slow down. There's this anticipation of what is about to come. and then you go into the drop, instead of just sliding into it like we saw in the Astrix track. We can see in the start, pretty similar structure. There's something interesting going on with the waveform in that you cannot really see where the fills end. One, because there tends to be a lot of filtering towards the end of the drop here. And two, the kick drums tend to go into the fills. You can see the waveform right here. You can definitely tell that there's a fill going on though, because you can see all of the risers, all of the things happening up until here. And then there's just silence, building it up again, getting ready for the next section. The same is kind of true here. In this case, I cannot really show it to you in waveform, but you can trust me that what is happening here is that the kick and bass continue up until this point where they're filtered out. And then here it's replaced with a drum fill, and then we go back into the normal kick and bass of the next section of the drop. Again, what we see here is that we have a breakdown right here, and therefore what is happening is that there's no fill right here. In this case, what is happening is that there's this gated vocal in this part of the drop, and that just continues into the breakdown, so that's what's causing the transition. And again, because we have that transition there, we don't really need the fill, because the element kind of just continues, but without the kick and bass. Now, a cool thing that is happening in this track, which is fairly new, something that I haven't seen a lot in like older psytrance, is that their structure is a 1, 2, 3 drop structure. And usually what you'll see for a 3 drop structure is that the first and the third drop are rolling kick and bass, and then your second drop is going to be something progressive. In this case, the first drop is the progressive drop. There's a progressive kind of bass line in there, not your standard rolling kick and bass. And then in this track, the second and third drop are rolling kick and bass. So musically speaking, what is happening here is that we have this second build-up here, and this is really lifting the energy from the kind of slow progressive bass line that is happening up until the rolling kick kind of energy. And that's happening also with a big kind of acid sequence on top, which obviously helps raise the energy level. Something interesting that we can see here is that we can see our first 8-bar section. As you can see right here, we have 7 bars of drop and then another bar of fill. But what is even more interesting is that right here we have a 12-bar section. And again, this is one of those parts where really the musical idea gets kind of offset by a little bit. Again, up until this point, everything has been kind of standard. We can continue through it. This is 3 sections of 16 bars. We have a 16-bar section here, 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 these 2 elements combined. And then right here, as you can see, we have an 8-bar section, so we would be at the halfway point. And right here, we're completely offset and we're at a 1/4 point of that 16-bar segment. Now, unfortunately, again, I cannot play you the musical idea, but basically what is happening is that here we're again kind of transitioning into a build-up. It's fairly weak of a build-up. It's not a build-up that is strong enough that I would place it in here as an actual build-up. Also, it's really hard to actually place it. There's no real justification of where I would stop this drop here. Like if I were to say that this would be the build-up, for example, then right here it's just going to sound like the normal kick and bass, the normal drop. So that doesn't really make sense. So it must transition somewhere. And you can see it in the waveform. This just looks like normal kick and bass waveform to me. And then this just looks like normal build-up waveform to me. But slowly it's transitioning in here. So that's why I didn't really mark it. Also, again, all of the drop elements just kind of continue and they rise a little bit, but really the drop kind of continues and fades into this build-up. But for some reason, the artist decided that an 8-bar build-up here was too long and no build-up just didn't work for the track. So for that reason, I think we just have this offset here to maybe even spice up the musical idea as a whole. We then go into this 32-bar segment. I have noted down a fill here because we have a small kick fill. Basically, the bass is removed for 1 beat and it's replaced by the kick, just 2 kicks playing where the last 2 bass notes would be. But essentially, you can treat this as one 32-bar segment. We then go into the breakdown and you can again see the massive length of this breakdown. This is really what progressive is about. And one of the interesting things here is that he is using a double build. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of it. I also listen to some hardstyle from time to time, and there's a concept called a fake drop or a fake build, where essentially you're building up to this point where everybody expects the drop to start, you have a little fill, and then the drop doesn't start. To me, that really takes me out of the flow of music, and personally, I think like if the music is specifically designed to induce a state of trance, something that unexpected where you think you're going to start dancing, but then you don't, doesn't really work for the genre. But obviously, artistically, it is a choice that you can make, and it is a very interesting one at that. But you can see from the waveform here, we have this massive long build-up. Everything is rising, energy is increasing. Then we have this fill, and then we go into another build-up. You can again see the snares kind of coming in here towards the end here. And then we have our actual very, very short fill here going into the drop. The next track that I want to show you is Sahara. There's also a lot of interesting things happening here. The first one is this massively long intro. This intro is actually 64 bars long. So this is a 16-bar segment, this is a 16-bar segment, this is a 16-bar segment, and this is a 16-bar segment. And you can again see that it's indicated by one long MIDI clip. This is because it just rises. Some more elements are added here, but it essentially just increases the energy slowly over time until the part where it has enough energy to actually go into the drop. Now after the intro, what you can see is that our first drop immediately goes into one of those build-ups, and therefore again we don't have one of those fills. This is something that again we saw before in the first Astrix track. Again, the elements of this drop just kind of continue into this build-up, and then we continue into whatever is happening after that. And for that reason, I think that the fill here is omitted. What's more interesting is what is happening here. We again have a 16 bar part, and then we go into this, not really a fill, not really a build-up, kind of this middle between a fill and a build-up. What's happening here is a little bit strange in that the elements that plays mainly in here, the main kind of offbeat plug that sits in here, also sits in here. You can actually see it on the waveform here. It's this little plug that kind of sticks out from all of these 4 parts. So there's just a little bit of a gap for people to have a little bit of a pause. And that again means that we don't really need to fill here because the element just kind of continues playing. The next part is again 24 bars long, and I've divided it up into 2 segments. What happens here is that the filter just kind of suddenly snaps into play. So this part is completely not filtered and this part is completely filtered, and it's just a static filter at a static position. It isn't turning up. And again, all of the elements kind of continue in here, so you still have the idea that this is part of the drop, but it's definitely different. Now what's happening here is that we have a 12 bar segment again. And initially I thought that this was just to correct for this little part in here, get us back on the grid. But you can see already the next one coming up, and this is again going to offset us. So it doesn't really care that much, I think, about staying in the grid. Now this is the segment where there's that very distinct vocal that is in here, the Sahara vocal, the one that I also used for my track in the beginning. Check that out as well, by the way. But what I think here the musical idea was is that 8 bars was just too long to wait for that vocal. And if you have it immediately, it doesn't really have that impact. So what you need is this little 4 bar pause and then the vocal coming in. And the vocal being 8 bars long, it just results in this kind of strange looking 12 bar segment. What happens then is that we again have an 8 bar segment, and what happens here is again the elements stay, but there's this vocal that is added, this spoken vocal. So what I think is happening here is that he's just filtering out the kick and bass to make space for it. What I don't understand is why you wouldn't do that 4 bars later, so that still your segment would be 16 bars long. There isn't really any melodic idea, I think, that ties this to needing to be 12 bars instead of 16 bars. That's a little bit strange to me. But then really up until the end of the track, it's all fairly basic stuff that we've seen before. What I do finally want to highlight for this track is the outro. This outro is fairly long, which is not very typical for psytrance. What happens here though is that you have this 8 bar segment in here where you can mix out of the track if you don't want to actually use the outro. But towards the end, there's that another famous vocal. This is that numbers vocal. If you ever have listened to the whole track, I'm sure you will remember. And Astrix is kind of known for having these cool little outros towards his track. Also Deep Jungle Walk has the same kind of thing where he resolves back to the intro vocal. And it's something that I don't see a lot of other artists play with, having an interesting outro, something that isn't just, okay, the kick and bass stops, now we just fade out. He actually put some time and effort into really finishing off his tracks, even if you don't hear that necessarily in a DJ set. Next up, we're going to get into Let's Get Weird by Earthspace and Technology. And what you'll immediately find with this track is that the structure feels much less complicated. When we look back here, you can see that there's all these little segments in here, these little extra things. And in a track like this, the grid isn't really showing in the track itself. Granted, in this track, it does open up with a 24 bar segment, so we are offset from the grid. But after that point, everything kind of makes sense. There's this one 8 bar part here, and then again you can see 16 bar parts. Also, you would think, until we zoom in. I'm going to zoom in right here, and you can see that this is our kind of segmented line, and what you'll see is that because this is 8 bars long, and we still need a fill to go into the actual drop, the rest of the track is actually offset by 2 bars. So you again can still see 16 bars here, with the little fill at the end here, very standard stuff, but it's again offset. So I think one of the main lessons here for now is that most of the tracks kind of work with the grid most of the time, and then they have slight offsets whenever they want to make the listener kind of out of the flow of the track. They want to say, okay, here there's something special maybe. Because most people do know kind of this general structure of music when they're dancing, it is these moments that really surprise them. Obviously, we as producers and especially DJs are just naturally counting the beats and knowing wherever we are in the track in terms of structure. But even for people that aren't like musically inclined like that, they still have somewhat of an idea of where a structure kind of is standard and where it's not standard. And I think the whole idea of going off the grid like this is to subvert those expectations. Now again, this is something that I'm questioning though, because to me it seems like if your goal is to put somebody in a state of trance, then subverting their expectations and not having them dance when they expect to start dancing. You know, right here, you're in that segment, you're dancing to it, you remember, okay, we're almost at that final part here, I can hear it building up, there must be something coming. And then there's this other 2 bars of where it's not really happening, of where the drop is not really playing. Personally, I would think that that's something that would never be done in a psytrance track. You want people to stay in that trance and to flow with the music. But one of my main discoveries looking at all of these tracks is that basically every artist does this. It at least happens in all of the tracks that I've examined so far here. Now for the rest of the track, there's not much interesting stuff happening in terms of offsets, in terms of weird structural ideas. It does look like this is a little bit weird, but this is 7 bars and this is the final bar. Again, all of these segments amount to either 8 or 16 bars, and the fills are just used to make up the space that is left out in these segments here. You can also see that this is much more traditional in its fill use, in that every segment ends in a fill where we transition into the next segment right here, right here, right there. Here we're again transitioning into a build-up like we saw before, but even that ends with a fill before we go into the next section. And then you can see again, all of the drops have just a final part here where there just is a little bit of a fill announcing, okay, we're going into the new section, let's get ready for another bit of dancing. Even towards the outro here, you can see that the kick and bass is just kind of going on up until here, and then you have this final fill here, and then you actually go into the fade out. And the same thing is true with this next track, which is Are You Awake by Mekkanikka and Michele Adamson. We can see here 16 bar intro, 16 bar build up, and then we go into our segments with fills at the end here. This is all very standard stuff. Here we just have a little bit of a build up where the kick and bass just fades out. Again, we have a fill, and this is where we get into our second drop. Now I talked about it before about the 3-drop structure and how it's usually a progressive bass line in the second part. This is where you can see that. Here you can see this is not your normal rolling kick and bass. You can see that from the waveform. What is interesting for this track though, is that it does go to a normal rolling kick and bass towards here. You can see this is still progressive. You can see all the little gaps in there. And then right here, it's just a sausage of waveform. And this is just kick and rolling bass line. Notice, however, that for the progressive part, all of the segments are 8 bars long. And then we go back into the rolling part and we get again 16 bar segments. We have our classical no fill before the breakdown, and then we have a little breakdown in here, and then we just build up again towards this fill here, where we get into the next part. There's an interesting thing, however, going on here in this third drop, in that we have 8 bars of kick and bass, and then we go back into a build-up. Now, this isn't your normal build-up like I talked about before, where you just filter out the kick and bass and have other elements come in to actually build up the track. This is actually where the kick doubles, and here again it doubles up until 16 notes, and it goes on and on faster and faster. So it actually loses immediately the pattern of the normal kick and bass. But you can again see for all of these segments, we're staying very, very close to 16 bars, and this is a much more standard drop, apart from the fact that you're again offset by due to having this one extra 8 bar segment here. If you were to remove this segment, you would see that up until the outro, it exactly lines up with our grid here. I can make that clearer if I import the MIDI tracks. You can see right here that everything just lines up with the grid. So you can see that this is a much more conventional structure if you exclude that one 8 bar part. And if not, then you just have everything right here just being offset again by 8 bars. So this is everything that I wanted to talk about. This is just some nice structural analysis that I like to do from time to time. One of the things that I want to communicate to you through this video is that you should also do this. You should also have a project like the one that I showed in this video, where you just go through a bunch of tracks and just decide to dissect them in one way or the other. In this case, we went for structure. Sometimes I like to go for the types of sound design that they like to use. Sometimes I like to look for little tricks. But it's overall a really good plan to have this experimentation from time to time, where you just look at, okay, what are other people doing and what can I implement in my tracks? I don't recommend that you steal any of these structures exactly from bar to bar, whatever they are doing exactly, but you just take all of the tracks and implement them into your own music. Hopefully one of the things that became clear through this video is that the structure adapts to the musical idea, and probably not the other way around like I've been doing up until this point. To be honest, the whole reason why I decided to do this experimentation and film this video was because I wanted to figure out why the thing that we saw in the last Learn from the Masters was actually happening. There we discussed for the first time that there was this little offset happening, and I wanted to figure out if this was more common. In doing so, I learned much more about structuring, in that the musical idea that dictates the structure, and not the other way around. So this means that personally for me, I'm going to slightly change up the way that I'm going to write music. I want to implement those ideas and I want to experiment with them in my own tracks, obviously, so I can see if I can make my music just a little bit more exciting. Now, hopefully you can do so too. Again, I recommend that you do one of these exercises yourself, but this is going to be everything for the video. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, let me know by leaving a like. And if you're new here, make sure that you're subscribed. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.